Okay, welcome everybody to the latest in our series of WebHub webinars. I'm Paul Hansbury. I'm Research Fellow in the Warwick Ukraine-Belarus Hub, and the topic for our webinar today is peace negotiations. What do they mean for Belarus, for Ukraine and Belarus? When we started planning the webinar series, thinking about topics back towards the end of last year, something we had in mind was Donald Trump's rather dubious claim that he could end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. To say that international politics about Ukraine have been tumultuous since he took office feels like something of an understatement. Trump and Putin had their phone conversation earlier this month, after which US and Russian officials met in Saudi Arabia to begin ostensible peace negotiations. So we're very much at the beginning of those negotiations, and indeed some would question whether they even are negotiations. Many observers are outraged that Ukrainians were not invited to the Saudi Arabia talks, and there has been quite a strong sense that the US wants Ukraine to capitulate to many of Russia's demands. Then, just 2 days ago, the US voted along with Russia and against Ukraine and many European NATO allies in 2 key UN votes, one in the General Assembly and one in the Security Council, something which would have been all but unimaginable until Trump took office. So we really are living in consequential times for international politics. Today's webinar asks what these negotiations over in Ukraine mean for Ukraine and Belarus, and we'll also think a little bit about the ramifications beyond that. To discuss the topic, we have a lineup of excellent speakers. They will each have 10 minutes to make some initial remarks, and then we will have questions and answers from the audience. Questions from the audience. I shall introduce the speakers properly before they deliver their initial remarks. Their biographical notes are very, very impressive. But quickly, they are David J. Kramer, Yuliya Kazdobina, Artyom Shraibman, and Rosemary Thomas. Interpretation into Belarusian is available for those who would like to hear that. That's via the interpretation button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. The event is being recorded and it will be uploaded to both our Warwick website and to YouTube after the event in the next couple of days. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box in Zoom. Regular attendees at our webinars will know that I usually read out questions without identifying who the person asking them is. The question is. If you would like to be identified, then please write your name and your affiliation after your question in the Q&A box. So our first speaker today is David J. Kramer, who serves as the Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute. Prior to moving to Dallas, he taught at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs in Miami. Before that, he worked in Washington, D.C. for 24 years in the think tank and NGO world, including as president of Freedom House. He also served 8 years in the US Department of State during the George W. Bush administration, including serving as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labour, and also as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, in which role he was responsible for Russia, Ukraine, Belarus and Moldova. So, David, the major change in the situation at present has not happened in Ukraine itself or even in Russia. It's very much the American change of government that has driven this topic, the noise and discussion on this topic at the moment. So dare I ask, can you give us a little bit of an overview from the US position, and is there something that you can reassure us about where the US policy is headed on Ukraine? The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for including me on a panel with such distinguished speakers. And also, I just want to salute you and your institute for what you have been doing to bring attention to this region. Extremely important to do. A couple weeks ago, I did a podcast in which I described the events that were unfolding, particularly here in Washington. I'm normally based in Dallas, but I happen to be in DC today, as head spinning and head scratching. And I have to say, in the 2 weeks since then, my head has been spinning even more, and I've been scratching my head even more. It is a little difficult to keep up with. What has happened so far this week is also pretty head spinning. We had the visit of French President Macron here on Monday. Tomorrow will be the visit of British Prime Minister Starmer. And then it appears on Friday, Ukrainian President Zelensky will be coming to Washington. These are rather extraordinarily important visits of these three leaders. And it is important that President Trump will be meeting with President Zelensky before he might have the opportunity to sit down and meet with Putin. It is, I think, also important that Macron and Starmer help set the record straight with President Trump on the situation in terms of what the Europeans are doing in providing assistance to Ukraine and the importance of staying with Ukraine and supporting Ukraine, and also reminding President Trump of the importance to have not only the Europeans involved, but another European country involved, and that, of course, is Ukraine itself. And the mantra of the Biden administration, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, I think should still stand. It should still be a key approach of the new Trump administration. And hopefully with the visit on Friday by President Zelensky, we will see that reinforced. The President Zelensky's trip will agreement between the United States and Ukraine dealing with rare earths and minerals. This has been the source of considerable controversy, if not outright disagreement, between the two governments. The Secretary of Treasury went to Ukraine to press the Ukrainian side for its signature on the document. The document has since been revised and has taken out some important sticking points from the Ukrainian perspective, including saying that Ukraine would essentially owe the United States $500 billion for assistance when the United States, in fact, has not provided $500 billion in assistance. The actual numbers are a little hard to discern. Overall, Congress has appropriated about $177 billion for Ukraine, but not all that was directly for Ukraine. Some of that was to beef up military presence in other parts of Europe. And even of the roughly 120 billion or so that has been provided for Ukraine, most of that money stays here in the United States. So the $500 billion that was originally in the minerals deal wasn't quite an accurate number. President Trump more recently has cited $350 billion. That too is not an accurate number. But what it still remains unclear is whether this deal will be, as President Trump has used the term, payback for assistance that the United States has provided in the past 3 years, or will reassure the Ukrainians that the United States will continue military assistance. And so I think it is a little up in the air what this will mean. My hope is that between the visits of President Macron and Prime Minister Starmer and then President Zelensky on Friday, that the Trump administration will be persuaded that it is important to continue assistance to Ukraine. That stopping that assistance will put Ukraine in a very vulnerable position, a weak position, and be incredibly unfair to the Ukrainian side, given what Russia has done. The other part of this that I think is important is some of the recent rhetoric and actions coming from Washington. We saw on Monday, as you mentioned, the vote in the UN General Assembly where the United States was not in very distinguished company opposing the resolution that Ukraine put forward that did properly blame Russia for this full-scale invasion. But it's also important to remember that all of this did not start on February 24th, 2022. This started back in 2013 when Putin pressured pro-Russian President Yanukovych not to sign agreements with the European Union. Then, following the Revolution of Dignity, the movement that saw a pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western government come into power, and Putin then used that as the pretext to launch the initial invasion of Ukraine. The other part, of course, is President Zelensky is a democratically elected leader of Ukraine. He was voted in 2019. I was there to observe both rounds of the election, and he has not faced re-election, or the country has not held new elections, because the country was forced to declare martial law as a result of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And under Ukrainian law, Ukraine is not able to hold elections when martial law is in place. So this kind of rhetoric about pressing Ukraine on elections and using terms that disparage Zelensky have not been helpful, to say the least. I realize I'm running out of time, but let me just make one or two more points. How we help and respond to Ukraine matters beyond just Ukraine. It matters beyond just Europe. It matters globally. China is watching how the United States will stand with Ukraine. That may have an influence on China's calculations vis-a-vis Taiwan. We've seen Iran and North Korea in particular provide critical support for Russia for its full-scale invasion. And this formation of what we call at the Bush Institute, CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, presents a dangerous axis that we have to recognize is a threat not just to Ukraine, but to all countries in the region and here even in the United States. And so we'll see what happens over the next few days. We'll see what happens. There are apparently supposed to be talks tomorrow in Istanbul between U.S. and Russian negotiators that are focused more on bilateral relations. But it does appear that the Trump administration is eager to try to get some agreement signed. The problem, of course, is Putin signs a piece of paper and doesn't live up to what he has agreed to. There is a long record of Russian violations and non-compliance with memoranda going back to 1994, friendship treaty with Ukraine, the Minsk agreements, of course, the deal signed with Sarkozy over Georgia. So there's no reason to think, in my view, that Putin will be any different this time. I'll end by saying it's important, I think, for the Trump administration, for the United States as a whole, and for the West as a whole, to never underestimate the Ukrainians. They have proven to be remarkably heroic, brave, and staunch defenders of not only their freedom, but our freedom, since they are on the front lines of freedom. And second, don't overestimate Putin's readiness to strike a deal. I don't think he would know what to do if this war came to an end, a war that he started, nor would he know what to do with all the hundreds of thousands of troops that he has sent, treating them as cannon fodder. So the hope is that the Zelensky visit and the other visits this week will return the United States to a better path, standing firm with Ukraine and standing up to the Russian invading forces. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That is a very good overview of the situation, very good setup for our discussion from here. I've just, looking at the things I've scribbled down as you were talking, I mean, you mentioned towards the end there, Georgia, and something we might come back to in Q&A is how the implications of current situation for other states in Russia's neighborhood geopolitically, such as Georgia or Moldova as well. I've also scribbled down CRINC as an acronym that I've not heard prior to this afternoon, which is an interesting one. And also we, with Trump's comments on elections and calling Zelensky a dictator, one thing that we also might try to push to Mr. Trump is just the practicality of organizing an election at a time when you have so many people displaced within the country. So there's certainly lots for us to pick up on in discussion later. So thank you very much for your initial remarks. We will move on now to our next speaker, Yuliya Kazdobina, who is since May 2023 a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism. From January to June 2024, she was visiting fellow and analyst at the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies, where she was researching and writing on the issues of Ukrainian and European security. As well, Yuliya is a former advisor to Ukraine's information policy minister, the role she held from 2016 till 2019, where she coordinated the drafting of the government information strategy for Crimea, which was adopted at the end of 2018. And from 2003 until 2014, she worked as a political analyst in the US Embassy in Kiev. So Yuliya, thank you very much for being with us today. I'd like to ask you to tell us something about how the new US administration is being perceived in Ukraine. As David mentioned, Zelensky will travel reportedly to Washington to meet Trump on Friday. Perhaps you have some thoughts on what Zelensky can hope to achieve at this point in time from those discussions. I'll give you the floor and you have 10 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And as everybody mentions today, that the recent turnaround in the U.S. policy has been breathtaking, right? And the changes that we've seen are unimaginable and sometimes are hard to digest and react to. And the things that have already been mentioned is the positions that the U.S. demonstrated at the UN General Assembly, voting for the resolution which refused to recognize Russia as the aggressor state, and also making it more complicated for the G7 to coordinate a statement for the same reason. So the U.S. does not agree that Russia characterizes the statement that Russia is an aggressor as too not conducive for making peace and for stopping the war in Ukraine. And so looking, what I was going to talk is about Ukrainian position in this conflict, and of course it has not changed much since the start of the war. Ukraine believes that Russia is the aggressor state, and that what Ukraine needs is a just peace. Meaning that Russia as the aggressor has to be punished. It has to withdraw its troops from the entire Ukrainian territory, and that Ukraine needs to become an independent and sovereign state which has its own right to choose its own alliances at the international stage. So until President Trump proclaimed his intention to end the war very quickly, Ukraine refused to talk to the Russian president. But since Trump started saying that both sides will have to sit down at the negotiation table and to make concessions, Ukraine actually has made some moves, and President Zelensky said that if the only way to bring peace to Ukraine is to talk to President Putin directly, he was willing to do so. And also previously he was refusing to agree to have Russian occupation of the Ukrainian territory based on the policy, because of the policy that Russia pursues on the Ukrainian territory, erasing Ukrainian identity and torturing and basically violating human rights of Ukrainian citizens who end up on the occupied territory. But under the pressure from the Trump administration, the President Zelensky moved a little bit and said that, okay, we recognize that we may not be able to restore Ukrainian territorial integrity immediately, but if we are provided security guarantees, then we may consider leaving part of the territory under the occupation, no matter how hard it is for us. And so, as I mentioned, officially ceding territory to Russia is not acceptable to Ukraine, and it may recognize the territory Russia now controls temporarily occupied and postpone deliberation for a certain period of time. Also, Ukraine says that if there is just a ceasefire, which is not guaranteed by any security, which is not supported by any security guarantees to Ukraine, most likely this is not going to be a stable peace, because President Putin and Russia, they have not given up their intentions to destroy Ukraine, and also their intention is wider than just to capture Ukrainian territories. They actually are aggressive towards the Western countries and the whole what used until recently used to be the transatlantic alliance. Now there are lots of doubts how viable the alliance is, but still Russia's goal is to destroy that transatlantic unity and destroy the world order that's based on rules, and that was forged by the United States after the end of the Second World War. President Zelensky says clearly that Ukraine will never agree to a peace plan which is developed without it. And also, Ukraine believes that whenever there is a negotiation discussing the future settlement, Europe must also be present at the negotiation table, something with which the United States doesn't seem to agree. And if we talk about the mood in the Ukrainian society, there is a clear distinction between peace and capitulation. So Ukrainians want peace. They want we want Russia to basically leave us alone and let us live our own life as an independent state. But we do not agree to surrender to the demands that Russia has been making. You probably know that by now, as a result of the war, Russia managed to capture part of Ukrainian 4 oblasts and Ukrainian Crimean Peninsula, and it included those territories in its constitution, but not only the territories that it captured, but also parts of the territory that it doesn't control. And it claims that because this is now part of the Russian constitution, Ukrainian troops have to withdraw from Ukrainian territory that Russia doesn't even control, because and that's what they call taking the reality on the ground into consideration. But nevertheless, Ukrainian society, when it comes to negotiating with Russia, in a poll that was conducted recently by a rating polling agency, it was based in February 2021. So 81% of Ukrainians believe that there should be a search for a compromise solution in negotiations, and that these negotiations should involve other countries. 64% of Ukrainians support direct negotiations with Russia. And however, 91% of Ukrainians categorically do not accept negotiations between the United States and Russia without Ukraine's participation. And the latest comprehensive nationwide survey on the issue of concessions that Ukraine was willing to make and on the peace negotiations generally was conducted by Ilko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation and Razumkov Center, which are very respectable polling organizations in Ukraine, in August of the last year. And again, the popular mood is leaning towards talk with Russia, but not towards meeting Russia's demands. And at that time of the survey, only 9% of Ukrainians said that they were ready to recognize the occupied territories as a part of the Russian Federation. That's something that Russia demands, even for the sake of ending the war. And this number did not change much since August of 2023. At that time, it was 5%. 81% of Ukrainians consider recognizing Ukrainian territory as part of Russia unacceptable. And also this number didn't change much since 2023. At that time, it was 90%. So if Ukraine territories remain occupied while the rest of the country receives security guarantees, 25% of Ukrainians are willing to support that deal, but the majority of 61% would still be opposed to this solution. So 44% believe it's absolutely unacceptable to refuse from NATO membership a future so most Ukrainians view NATO membership as a security guarantee for Ukraine, and 44% believe that this is unacceptable, and 22.3% believe that it's absolutely unacceptable to give up this promise of NATO membership. And majority of Ukrainians find it absolutely unacceptable to abandon membership in the European Union. And the large losses Ukraine has already suffered in the war are perceived by a relative majority as a reason not to agree to peace that will not meet Ukraine's needs and demands, and that is 45%. So Ukrainian society understands that we're fighting an existential war, and although we do want peace, we do not agree to capitulation to the Russian demands. And President Zelensky expresses this societal mood clearly in the international stage. So when we're talking about the reaction to the recent change in the US position, of course, it was an emotionally harrowing time for many Ukrainians, because initially when the Trump administration came, many messages sounded rather encouraging when Trump said that he favored the peace, truth, strength approach, and Ukrainians also believe that this is the way that Russia has to be forced into first stopping the aggression, and then actually a deterrent needs to be built to make sure that it doesn't attack again. But as the time went on, first the President Trump had a phone conversation with President Putin, and the policy of diplomatic isolation of the Russian Federation was reversed, something that both a Ukrainian government and Ukrainian civil society opposed. And then we went through the period of President Trump attacking and bullying President Zelensky, and we also saw Ukrainian society stand up behind him, and several Ukrainian organizations made statements against it, and made statements in support of explaining why Ukraine cannot have an election during the wartime. And even politicians who are opponents to President Zelensky said that he is a legitimately elected Ukrainian president, and it's only for Ukrainians to decide when to elect a new one. So
we have the last couple of sentences.
And last point is about this agreement that Mr. Kramer mentioned on the Ukrainian rare earth minerals. The latest has been that after this period of quarreling and arguing, both sides were able to sit down and discuss the agreement constructively, and its text has been was published recently online. I have not had a chance to look at it, but from what I understand, some of the worst points that Ukraine was opposed to are no longer there. And the discussion is about a joint fund to which both sides are going to contribute, and which is going to then work to restore the Ukrainian economy. But it's not really clear what relevance this agreement has to the so-called peace process, because it's about Russia, about the US and Ukraine exploiting Ukrainian resources jointly, but it does not come with any security guarantees that Ukraine actually needs to be able to stop or prevent further Russian aggression. And for when President Zelensky comes to Washington, the statements that are coming from President Trump is that Ukraine will be allowed to continue fighting the war, and some messages that came from the Ukrainian government just maybe like very not long before this seminar is that there will be some security guarantees attached, but there is no detail on that yet.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Yuliya. It's helpful to have the have some of the survey data which you cited, and I think peace but not capitulation is an important and resounding message. As you said, Russia is claiming sovereignty over territory that it hasn't even managed to take control of at present. And something that the audience might think about when formulating questions as well is the role of the pocket of territory in the Kursk Oblast of Russia that Ukrainian forces have been able to hold on to for, going back to, I think, was it August, September times? From last summer.
August 6th is when they started.
Yeah, so that might be quite an important bargaining chip in Ukraine's hands when it does actually manage to get into some talks, which it must, of course. I remind the audience, please, you're welcome to put questions into the Q&A box for all of our speakers. You can put questions into that box at any time. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you want to be identified, then please put your name and affiliation in the box when you write your question. We will move to our next speaker. Next up, we have Artyom Shraibman. Artyom is a political analyst, the founder and director of Sense Analytics, a consultancy, and he is a non-resident scholar with the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. A graduate of the Belarusian State University and the London School of Economics, Artyom formerly worked for Tut.by, which was the most successful independent media outlet in Belarus for a long time. Belarus occupies an interesting position here when it comes to negotiations to end the war. Lukashenko has obviously given a lot of support to Russia, to its war effort. Artyom wrote a really fascinating article back at the end of 2023 in Foreign Affairs, where he argued that Lukashenko benefits from ongoing hostilities, which raises the obvious question of what it means for the regime in Belarus if there is a ceasefire. But also more generally, what talks mean both for Belarusians, for the Belarus under Lukashenko, but also perhaps for the opposition to Lukashenko, who have also been trying to engage, get their voice into negotiations. So, Artyom, what does this mean for Belarus generally? The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for inviting me. I think that it's obviously very hard to give and to have to make any like inferences about Belarus's role, place, benefits, or risks from this negotiation process because there are so many unknown variables in this, and discussing Belarus just adds a layer of unknown to this discussion because we don't know a lot about the parameters of the future potential deal. I am even skeptical that the deal or even ceasefire can be reached in the foreseeable future. So that's why this is kind of a disclaimer on my end that whatever I'll be speaking about is highly speculative at this stage, and it may well not materialize at all because, again, currently as things stand, I'm not sure that the sides of the war have come significantly, substantially closer to the deal or the lasting peace or even a sustainable a ceasefire, despite the active and sometimes some would argue erratic efforts of Trump administration to do something with this. So when it comes to Belarus's fruits it can get from this process, it obviously depends on the actual scale of progress in talks. If there is no substantive progress, like either the talks fail or basically the Russia Ukraine managed to secure some short-lived ceasefire, and then it breaks apart. I'm not confident that there will be any deep changes for Belarus's relationship with Russia or with the EU, with the West in general, stemming from these developments. These changes might happen because Trump administration introduces a lot of changes into how it engages with the region and with Belarus as well, and we can talk about this separately. But the war itself, if it just pauses for a while and the ceasefire doesn't hold, for example, or if it's not reached, it doesn't create a momentum for deep changes in Belarus's relationship with anyone. On the contrary, I would say if Russia, following the failure of some talks, sees the need to escalate to demonstrate that you better listen to its interests, you better, compromise. By you here, I obviously mean the West and Ukrainians. Then Belarusian territory and using and like engaging Belarus in the war deeper than it has been engaged is, of course, one option of this escalation. So I can easily imagine Russia stepping up its use of Belarusian territory in response to failed talks or to broken ceasefire, for example. And this usage of Belarusian territory can be both in terms of like tactical use, like deployment of actual troops, weapon system threatening Ukraine from the north again, if, of course, the capabilities allow for it, like if there are available manpower. And there will be a perfect pretext for this escalation later this year. There will be Zapad exercises that are expected probably somewhere in the third quarter of this year. And President Zelensky has already mentioned several times the risks that Russia can move actually a lot of troops, more than 100,000 troops into Belarus for these exercises. But also another form of this like use of Belarus in case of Russia's desire to escalate is what Russia has been doing for the last year or so, or even more, year and a half, is using Belarus for strategic signaling vis-a-vis the West. Here I mean nuclear blackmailing, like deploying the nuclear weapons, which Russia allegedly did a year and a half ago, but also nuclear exercises that it conducted. And now the next phase is deploying this brand new, reportedly brand new Oreshnik missiles into Belarus, which Putin and Lukashenko announced as the possibility back in December. And I can easily imagine that if de-escalation talks fail, Putin will move ahead with the plans to actually deploy or pretend to deploy Oreshnik missiles in Belarus, because just as with the nuclear weapons, we have not seen any actually tangible evidence of their presence in the country, despite like two autocrats saying the opposite. Now, if we are moving through our branch of scenarios towards the ceasefire, if we actually witness a ceasefire in Ukraine, it creates multiple risks, but also opportunities for Belarusian authorities, for Minsk. I think that first opportunity that they will definitely try to pursue is inserting themselves into the talks somehow. Belarus is unlikely to be like very instrumental to military arrangement around ceasefire, like sending peacekeepers or I don't know monitors to observe the ceasefire, because again, Belarus is too closely aligned to Russia. Nobody perceives it as in any way neutral or reliable actor here. But prisoner exchanges, other humanitarian arrangements might be logistically organized via Belarus, as they have been for the last couple of years. And this involvement of Belarus in this post-war sort of settlement or post-fighting settlement can give Belarusian leadership some reasons like to elevate or to emphasize its importance in the eyes, for example, of Washington. And I can easily imagine Lukashenko trying to sell his involvement in implementing any kind of a deal in Ukraine-Russia war as an argument to Trump administration that, for example, it should return the embassy back to Minsk because important things happen on the soil, so you better have your representatives here. And since you don't care about human rights anymore, I mean, compared to the previous administration, and you restore ties with diplomatic ties with Russia, why not restore them with Belarus? I think this will definitely be an opportunity for Lukashenko to do it. When it comes to sanctions relief, again, multiple unknowns here. Will the West be united in lifting some sanctions of Russia following this ceasefire, or will it just be the US who will be doing it unilaterally? Non-obvious question at this stage. For Minsk, it's a very important question because it is the EU who implemented the toughest restrictions, the most painful restrictions on Belarus. So it's important for Minsk to have EU also on board of this sanctions de-escalation, sanctions lifting process. Otherwise, again, US sanctions relief would be welcome, of course, but it wouldn't solve the good chunk of the problems that this sanctions created for Minsk. Another challenge here is not to be forgotten in the process of sanctions relief, because again, we are purely speculative here, but I can easily imagine Trump administration lifting some kind of sanctions, some sanctions from Russia as a step to appease or to, I don't know, secure some concessions from Moscow, but forgetting about the same sanctions being implemented on Belarus in parallel a couple of years ago, simply because Belarus is just not on anybody's radars in the White House. This is also conceivable, and I think Lukashenko would want to avoid being forgotten in this sanctions relief process. I think that in this scenario, Lukashenko will definitely try to activate his bilateral, in scenario of a ceasefire, activate his bilateral diplomacy with the US, as he has been doing with the prisoner releases recently, political prisoner releases, and also, if possible, with the EU, because and individual member states as well. Precisely to ensure that he is not left out, because most of the sanctions against Belarus were actually introduced and adopted because of its participation or co-aggression or facilitation Russian war effort. So he needs to use the opportunity to remind that, okay, this reason has ceased to exist, so please consider dropping the sanctions. And I think that in this scenario, we might see some faster amnesty of political prisoners, because it would be the easiest way to attract attention of Western policymakers to Lukashenko, and the need also not to forget him in this process. Of course, big question here is what happens with the Russian economy. Do the Western companies return? It creates like a huge challenge of its own for Minsk, because it increases the competition on the Russian market. Lukashenko has already voiced his concerns about this, that if the Western companies return, not sure how much market will be left for Belarusian companies and Belarusian exports. Belarusian exports to Russia already contracts and because of the stagnation in the Russian economy and competition from China, and it will only continue to do so. So if Western companies return, it suddenly creates a new set of problems. Also, what's important is what happens with Russian military-industrial complex following the ceasefire, because I don't expect like a sudden halt of military production. Putin would likely use this period to rearm, to basically refuel his war machine. And this means that probably the demand for Belarus military-related goods will still be there. So this is, but again, in case of a sustainable ceasefire, will it last? Also an open question, very important for the state of Belarusian economy. Now, if we get to the final possible scenario, like full-fledged peace negotiations, something bigger than just a ceasefire, some kind of talks to actually define the parameters of post-war Central and Eastern Europe, maybe all Europe. In this scenario, obviously, Minsk will aim to participate in any of such summit or talks format. And with the Russia's backing, I think it's not impossible. Because for Russia, it's always useful to have an extra loyal voice at the table. Minsk will echo everything that Russia will demand or propose. But for Minsk, it's an opportunity to regain international legitimacy and agency in the eyes of the Western and everybody else, not just Western governments. So it sort of lifts many or helps to repair a lot of damage done since 2020 if Belarus is somehow involved, represented by Minsk, I mean, Minsk official authorities, somehow involved in this peace process, potential peace process on Ukraine. But that's, of course, the maximalist objective. I'm not sure that it will materialize, but again, I wouldn't completely discard this possibility if we are in the scenario of a full peace summit. And I see you also hinting that I need to wrap up by turning on your mic. I will just a couple phrases, literally. I think Lukashenko will definitely, in this scenario, pursue full sanctions relief and potentially, as a next step, even a restoration of some economic ties with Ukraine. I understand how unfeasible it sounds right now, but I think that this will be the intention. But of course, biggest unknowns in both cases, ceasefire and peace, is how does Russia see Belarusian territory and its post-war in its post-war strategic planning, because the range of scenarios here is actually very wide. On the positive end of this spectrum, there might be some agreement between Western powers, Ukraine, Russia, not to deploy certain military capabilities or exceeding certain number of troops, foreign troops on Belarusian soil as a trust-building measure, post-war trust-building measure. Certain demilitarization of Belarus, denuclearization of Belarus, for example, as a part of the security guarantee to Ukraine, for example, or to eastern flank of NATO. On the negative end of this scenario spectrum, so to say, there might be further militarization of Belarus, for example, by Russia, obviously, in response to militarization of Poland or Baltic states, or to deployment of potential EU or European peacekeepers in Ukraine. Russia might decide simply that, okay, you put your troops in there in bigger quantities, we put our troops in bigger quantities in Belarus. And obviously a lot, if not everything, in Belarus's future trajectory completely depends on the parameters of this deal or lack thereof. Thank you.
As always, Artyom, you are measured and thought-provoking. There was the ominous line, if Russia sees a need to escalate, how it might use Belarus for those purposes. But there was also the question, the issue of desanctioning Russia, and my mind was running away when you started talking about sanctions relief, thinking about how that ramifies for Belarus, and if American companies return to trading with Russia, how that might actually harm the current Belarusian state, something which I hadn't really been thinking about, and so certainly something, the sanctions question is something that our next speaker might also pick up. Should, as Artyom mentions, the EU are the bigger trading partners of Belarus than the US, and likewise, they're a more natural trade partner for Ukraine than the US. If the Trump administration does engage in some desanctioning, should the UK and the EU align with that? Do they, or is that their biggest source of leverage over what happens in the region? But I'm running slightly ahead of myself. So what I should say is our final speaker today is Rosemary Thomas, who is a former UK diplomat. Rosemary served as the United Kingdom's ambassador to Belarus from 2009 until 2012. She has also worked in the EU Border Assistance Mission in Ukraine and in Moldova. The dates for those are 2005 to 2006 and 2015 to 2016. As a diplomat, in her career as a diplomat, I'm sure she often had to respond to events as they happened very quickly. I am very grateful that she agreed just yesterday afternoon to step into this panel at the last moment. So thank you very much for that. You can perhaps give us, you may want to respond to some of what we've heard from the previous three speakers, but also it would be good if you can perhaps tell us how you see the broader regional implications of the latest developments and what this means for the liberal international order more broadly. Over to you, Rosemary.
Okay, thank you very much. So there's just two caveats. I'm speaking obviously in my own private capacity, and I'm not privy to what UK government policy is. And the second one is, yes, thank you very much for mentioning that I'm a sort of last minute entry, so I haven't had a massive amount of time to prepare. So apologies if it's a bit rough and ready. Before I go on to that broader picture stuff, just touching on Belarus itself, you asked me about UK policy and to look at EU human rights policy. I actually don't think UK policy differs that much from EU policy. And it's trying on the one hand to defend human rights and democracy, trying to keep that alive, while at the same time supporting Belarusian sovereignty and avoid it falling further into the clutches of Russia. But I must say, I find those two are, if not completely contradictory, it's actually a very, very difficult balancing act, because we are seeing it as imperative to punish Belarus, not just because of the election aftermath, but also because of its complicity in crimes against Ukraine. And it presents so many dilemmas, and we're all desperate to see the release of the political prisoners. Would the UK, would the EU agree to lift sanctions for political prisoners? Now, the issue with that is, as we've seen before, Lukashenko can just collect a load more to trade in at another stage. You can't trust him, just like you can't trust Putin. So that whole issue of sanctions is quite tricky. I mean, looking at whether the US lifts sanctions as part of the peace process, well, I think the EU has quite a lot of incentive for keeping them, because to all intents and purposes, Russia is at war with the EU and has been for a long time, and the EU may not have been willing to sort of agree to that, but it's been running a low-level war against the West, in fact, but specifically against Europe for a very long time. And therefore, I think the EU would find it hard to lift sanctions against Russia and Belarus if that's just going to mean them getting the technology they need to keep their war machine going. So there's all sorts of dilemmas. That said, if the US says the only way we will give any kind of European defence mission in Ukraine, the only way we'll provide a backstop is that if you join us in lifting sanctions, that's something that Europe would have to look at very seriously. The US might, this new, quite rapaciously commercial US, might look for opportunities in Belarus, and that removes a lot of levers that the EU currently has over Belarus. So quite a confusing picture. But moving on to the wider picture, I agree with what everyone else has been saying, that this post-war world order is over. It's like the whole card table has been upturned, and we've got to see where those cards will fall. At best, US pressure could bring about an end to the war, but if it's handled seriously, and at the moment, if it's not handled seriously, and at the moment I see no reason why it would be, it won't provide a lasting peace, and it will simply be a pause for Russia to rearm and regroup ahead of a third wave of invasion. In the worst case scenario, US has upturned the whole world order. This might is right approach is actually very damaging, because it will give carte blanche to existing and would-be autocrats, and could lead to potentially a huge loss of civilian lives, as well as massive migration flows, because of the instability that will flow from that. I think many of the institutions which currently form the keystones of the existing global security architecture could be in danger of collapsing, or of being hollowed out to the extent that they're incapable of fulfilling their mission. That includes most UN institutions. Trump is famously quite dismissive of the UN. Let's look at the sanctions against officials from the International Criminal Court, for example, and the US intention to withdraw from the World Health Organization. And again, if Trump seeks to force a situation where the G7 brings Russia back into the fold and making it the G8, well, the G7 as such could collapse. So this means we're at a massive inflection point, but in particular, Europe is at a massive inflection point, because its very values, the whole world order it's rested on, the international security architecture it's rested on, all of that is under challenge right now. And the challenge before Europe right now is it must absolutely rise to this occasion and become a great power, be able to exercise this level of power, or it risks quite a messy disintegration. And I think we could see that having huge implications if the EU can't find a way to negate Trojan horses like Hungary that are undermining European security. There's potential for the EU to have to actually reconstitute itself. So all of these implications are massive. It's going to have to become a very serious defence power, because the US has made it clear it's no longer interested in European security. And even if there should be a new government after Trump goes, the trust has been lost. The trust has been completely lost. And in a way, that gets rid of Article 5, because Article 5 rests on trust. Otherwise, it's not really a deterrent. I believe it's absolutely critical. It's completely existential for Europe to defend Ukraine from Russia's determination to either dominate it or to make Ukraine disappear completely, but also from the USA's destructive policies. And likewise, it has to defend itself. It needs to get really real about defending itself from attacks on its own democratic structures. Russia has been trying to undermine them for decades, and it appears that J.D. Vance seems to be bent on the same mission. So, this is unbelievably serious for Europe. In coming to this idea of how Europe is going to support a ceasefire and a settlement, I think US support is going to be absolutely critical for the EU to carry out such a mission. And it's very hard to see what other troops could be used other than European troops. This is not going to be a classic UN Blue Helmet mission. This is not about peacekeeping. Russia will not keep its word on anything. It will be constantly probing the border. It's already said that it would regard the presence of European troops, it would regard that as a hostile act, and they could be subject to being targeted by Russia. It's a 1,000-kilometre long border. so it's not going to be, it can't be a peacekeeping mission, because the rules of engagement would have to allow for the actual active deterrence against Russia. All of that said, I don't think you're going to see European soldiers along that conflict border. I think it's much more realistic to look at the core tasks which are mentioned under the 2024 Compact for Ukraine that was put together by Biden. I think Europe will take over leadership of that compact, and it will have to treat it as a way of the principal way of providing training and security and weapons to Kiev, as well as developing Ukraine's defense industry, sharing intelligence and promoting interoperability. And that would ensure that Ukraine gets what it needs to deter Russia, because European troops are not going to be fighting along the border with Russia. And Europe really needs to step up and show this leadership. And that's got to be long-term political and financial commitment to develop the compact as a key mechanism for European security. And flowing from that, we probably need to link in with the Estonian proposal that European states commit 0.25% of their GDP for Ukraine to carry out these core tasks that will keep its country sovereign and allow them to defend themselves from Russia. And I think I might actually leave it there. But just before I sign off completely, I'd like to note today that in the Houses of Parliament here in the UK, the Foreign Secretary has said for the first time that the UK policy will be to try to seize Russian assets. And I think that's going to be essential. It can't be that European taxpayers are going to have to pay for the whole bulk of the reconstruction of Ukraine, because it looks as if the US won't want to take part in that. And I think, although Europe has been incredibly supportive of Ukraine on the whole, European citizens, I think they're going to see it as very unfair that while they're already in a difficult economic situation, that they're being expected to pay yet more for the reconstruction of Ukraine. So if those assets aren't seized, there's quite an illogic that builds up there. Yes, Europe, just in terms of action points, the whole of Europe, not just Northern Europe, needs to wake up and realise that Russia is at war with Europe. I think EU membership for Ukraine is absolutely vital. And the last thing I would say, as Churchill used to put it on most important documents when he wanted action this day.
Okay.
And I'll leave that there, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Rosemary. I mean, there are some, you've tackled some of the such big questions there that it's, and yet you've articulated them very, very well, which is a very challenging thing to do, because you're talking about the prospective collapse of the liberal post-war rules-based order, and I mean, it is quite mind-boggling what we could be in the process of. I mean, you mentioned about US withdrawal from some international intergovernmental organizations. I would point out that the executive order that Donald Trump signed not too long ago, which froze US participation and funding for UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, and UNESCO and the UN Human Rights Council, also ordered a review of US participation in all international intergovernmental organizations. So it is quite possible that we will see US withdrawal from more organizations in the months ahead, while Trump has the ability to operate with a certain amount of latitude in the US domestic setting. Now, so thank you for those remarks. I'm conscious we have actually quite a number of questions from the audience. I'm going to try and put a question to each person. Yuliya, you look like you're itching to say something. So very, very quickly, please.
No, there was a question about like what a ceasefire may look like. So if
Oh,
I don't know if you were going to ask that question of anybody else.
okay, I will ask that question then. Let me ask the question to each of the speakers, each of you, and then it will give a bit of a moment for you, well, three of you to collate your thoughts. We'll go to Yuliya first. So the question that will come to you, Yuliya, then is, so the question was about what a ceasefire looks like. I was also going to ask you war crimes. How in negotiations is Ukraine pressing for some kind of accountability mechanisms as an essential condition? How does the Ukrainian side rank accountability for that in the negotiation process? So those are some questions that will for you to address in a moment. Let the questions. I've got quite a number. So a question that is directed at this question comes from Deutsche Welle. Deutsche Welle ask. A question. So this one I'll direct at. It's directed to Mr. Kramer and Ms. Thomas. I'll ask it to David. How does the West view? Sorry, what role does the West think Belarus can play in peace negotiations? And the question, but also perhaps one that David might take is. Oh, okay. Well, there's a question. What is the basis for the assertion that Russia will threaten NATO member states in a few years? Is Russia really making such progress in building up its military potential? And it seems the Kremlin is not demonstrating this in relation to Ukraine. And I think there's a serious point there that Russia has not been hugely successful in its war aims in Ukraine, at least until Trump came into office. So why do we overestimate not Russia's intentions, but its capabilities to move on beyond Ukraine? A question I'll direct to Rosemary is with all the bombshells coming from Washington and EU leaders queuing up to appease Trump to support Ukraine. Are we at a tipping point of order breaking? And if so, what is positive and negative about it in your what is positive and negative about it in your view? Can Europe positive and negative in your view, is it becoming a multi-order world, and can Europe uphold its vision of solidarity and rules-based order? Does it need well, you've addressed the stronger military component, but I suppose the question, Rosemary, is there any positives in this for the UK and Europeans generally? And who have I not asked a question to? So I've given a question to Yuliya, to David, to Rosemary, Artyom. There are several questions directed at Artyom. So a question here from what are the consequences of the recent US diplomatic mission to Minsk created by the Belarusian Democratic Forces? And a broader question, Artyom, about the Belarusian democratic movement and its position vis-a-vis America in the present situation. Okay, so there's a series of questions there. So we'll go to Yuliya, if we can go to you first, and then we'll go to the other speakers in the order in which they spoke. So Yuliya, on the ceasefire
and war crimes, right? Okay. So when it comes to ceasefire, at this point, I don't think that no matter how much President Trump may try, I don't think it's possible to actually establish a ceasefire, because Russia still preserves the initiative on the battlefield, and the measures that President Trump threatened to apply to Russia as a means of leverage, so meaning like strengthening sanctions or raising oil prices, those do not necessarily depend on the US alone, and also are going to take a long time to have an effect. So most likely this is not something that's going to get President Putin to stop and to stop his aggression. And also, if you're offering Putin concessions, he sees that as a weakness. And so when President Trump tries to put relations with Russia on a better footing, and that's also not going to produce a positive effect, because Putin will just take that and demand more. That's their Russian way of conducting negotiations. You bite off as much as you're given, and at this point, I do not see the leverage that the US can apply that would have an immediate effect on Russia. I know that there is a lot of talk about the Russian economy breaking and Russia not being able to mobilize enough military personnel, but to me, it seems that people who say that they actually don't realize how much of a burden Russian people are willing to take and how much in an information ghetto they live. And so they have this besieged fortress mentality, and they are fighting for their country. I mean, we understand that this is Russian aggression against Ukraine, but in their perception, it's something totally different. So they're willing to take a lot of burden. So Putin, at this point, still is in control of the situation domestically. And so our hopes that somehow he's going to make to stop fighting, to enter a ceasefire is not very likely. But also, even if there is an agreement signed on a ceasefire, we have a pretty long history of trying to negotiate a ceasefire throughout all the 8 years of the conflict in the east of Ukraine. And there were over 20 attempts to establish a ceasefire, and those never held. I mean, there were attempts when Ukraine unilaterally said it was not going to fire, and then Russia did. There were agreements, and they were always violated. And it's not because Ukraine does not want peace, it's because Russia preserves the ability to escalate, and its goals are larger, and it's willing to use force to keep coercing Ukraine. And there is still no leverage that can stop it. So I don't believe. So I think that the most likely scenario is that there will be negotiations, and Trump, like many US administrations and also Ukrainian administrations before him, will get frustrated and will understand that you can't really reach a settlement with Russia until you build a strong leverage against it. If we talk about Russian war crimes in Ukraine, of course, this is a very important component, but at this point, it doesn't look like they are a part of any sort of negotiation, because now it's not even a peace negotiation, as you mentioned, that is happening. It's now the US trying to get to the first stage to at least get the parties to stop firing at each other. But bringing Russia to responsibility for keeping it accountable for all the multiplicity of war crime that it has committed by attacking residential areas, by deporting Ukrainian children to Russia, by torturing civilians, and like many other things, shooting Ukrainian prisoners of war, doing that on camera and posting the videos online as a tool of hybrid warfare. It's very essential for Ukraine as a part of the just peace to bring to hold Russia accountable, and also it's important to make sure things like this do not happen again. And so Ukraine is working towards establishing a tribunal for Russian war crimes. But we will see. I mean, when the actual negotiations start, and if they start, how this is going to play in the negotiations.
Okay, thank you. And so, David, for you, it was a question about the actual military threat to NATO member states from Russia, and also if you have a brief comment on the role Belarus may play in the role of Belarus in negotiations.
If I can, I'll be very quick, but I do want to just pick up on a few points here. On war crimes, I agree completely with Yuliya. They should never be forgotten. I sadly don't think Putin and Russian officials involved in war crimes against Ukraine will be held accountable, but they should be very much on our mind when there's this push to normalize relations with a government that has engaged in war crimes and, frankly, genocide against the Ukrainian people. That should force us to apply the brakes on any normalization efforts. I agree on ceasefire, but Putin is not serious about a ceasefire. He wants the removal of the current Ukrainian government. He wants recognition, as Yuliya was saying, of territory that Russia doesn't even currently occupy, and he wants permanent neutrality for Ukraine. The United States, whether Ukraine is in the room or not, should never agree to any of those conditions. And as long as the United States stays firm on that, then we won't see a ceasefire. But it also reinforces the need for Ukraine to be in the room anytime there is discussion about Ukraine. You cannot talk about Ukraine without Ukraine's presence there. On Russian assets that Rosemary mentioned, 100% agree. There is $300 billion sitting there that Russia should never get back, but that should go to Ukraine as a slight down payment for the Russian damage that has been done to Ukraine. It is unconscionable to me to think that any other country should be paying for the damage that Russia has done. Russia needs to pay first and foremost before anyone else does. On Belarus and negotiations, I don't see any role whatsoever for Lukashenko. As Artyom was getting at, this invasion, likely full-scale invasion, would likely not have been launched had Lukashenko not permitted Russian forces to use Belarus territory to launch the invasion. So Belarus, Lukashenko, frankly, should be indicted for war crimes too, for his complicity in what has happened to Ukraine. Last point on the Russian threat to NATO. The threat to NATO would come in two ways. One, if we allow Russia to prevail in Ukraine, however one wants to define prevail, I don't think it will, but if we basically wash our hands of it, if Trump loses interest and says this is Europe's problem to fix and the Europeans don't rise to the occasion. The second would be if, as Rosemary was getting at, we don't put stock in Article 5. The reason Putin has not militarily attacked another NATO member state is he actually does believe in Article 5. He thinks that the United States would be there if there were an attack on a NATO member state. There have been now questions raised about the United States' reliability when it comes to that, and that's what would make some of the current NATO member states, the Baltic states in particular, vulnerable to the possibility. But yes, the questioner's comment, Russia has suffered enormous losses as a result of Putin's decision to launch this full-scale invasion. Casualties now on the order of over 800,000 on the Russian side, tremendous damage to its military capabilities, but we can't let Russia do this again. And so if there is a deal to end this war, it has to be sustainable, it has to be fair, it has to be just, and it has to make sure that Russia doesn't threaten Ukraine or any other country again.
Thank you. And Artyom, to you, the question about the influence of the Belarusian democratic movement on US in DC.
Thank you. Just a brief maybe remark to David on what he said before. I agree with you that Lukashenko should be indicted and should not participate in these talks. What we believe should happen does not always mean that it will happen, and I don't think that discarding the chance that he will be involved or rather brought to the table by Moscow, I don't think is like completely secure prognosis here, because to be perfectly honest, if and when, or rather if I would say, this conflict ever comes to a stage of something like a peace summit, maybe years from now, and Putin demands the participation of Lukashenko, I'm not sure that anybody would obstruct the whole process just in order not to let this autocrat be legitimized. So unfortunately, I see it as one of the possibility in case we are getting to something more multilateral than we see these days. To the questions on the democratic forces, I think that the biggest impact for them right now is also coming from on their operations. Impact on their operations is also coming from US, but not directly from Donald Trump's attempt to negotiate with Putin, but from the closure of the USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, and other support programs, which hits Belarusian democratic forces, civil society, and media very hard. And the question, I think, probably should be reframed to how exactly the remnants of the Belarusian democratic community and democratic forces, after the dust settles down, will position themselves vis-a-vis these processes, vis-a-vis this trends of diplomatic efforts, some kind of resets and relationship. I think that more likely than not, democratic forces will stick to the similar position they have today, at least as long European Union is on this track. Because the fact that United States has decided to make this rapid turn towards diplomacy does not necessarily mean that it will change the isolated position of Lukashenko immediately. Because again, too much depends on the EU and the neighbors' position, Poland, Lithuania, and others. And therefore, for the democratic forces, there's not too many incentives right now to dramatically change their position. At the same time, with the political prisoner releases coming to the forefront of the agenda and discussions between both US and Minsk, but also within the Belarusian democratic forces, we probably will see some further adjustment of positions where some previously hardline speakers would allow for more flexibility, let's say, or would encourage or maybe endorse more targeted dialogue on the issue of political prisoners between the Western capitals and Lukashenko, simply because this process is becoming normalized by the actions of not just Trump administration, but potentially European countries as well. Because I'm not sure that if the US starts this dialogue, if other countries expand their diplomatic presence in Belarus, and there are rumors then Slovakia will soon send the ambassador, this might become some sort of a new trend, like a diplomacy or diplomatic engagement with Lukashenko, with Belarusian authorities. And I think in this narrow question, I think Belarusian democratic forces may become more flexible as a result of this change of, let's say, wind.
Okay, thank you. And Rosemary, are there any positives in the collapse of the liberal order? You need to unmute yourself. Oh, can I unmute you?
Yeah, positives and negatives. It's no secret that the UN has been increasingly dysfunctional for many years now, and that the UN Security Council itself is wildly imbalanced. So, if we are busy pulling all the walls down, I guess that's an opportunity to build back better. But whether we do build back better, of course, is something we can't, we can't necessarily control. But I think it does force responsibilities on certain countries and groups of countries, the BRICS, for example. Instead of complaining about everything, can they actually build something really positive that works? Because, they have a big stake themselves in upholding, in general, the rules-based international order. Are they going to push up, or are they going to sort of suffer the consequences if the system really does fall apart? Yes, I do think you will see this multipolar world developing much more quickly. Pax Americana is over. Rome seems to be burning. Let's hope it's not as dramatic as that. But it will give China a chance to accelerate its rise. The Middle East has had to cope with the way the US is approaching Gaza. It's going to have to get more serious about organizing itself. I think it could be extremely salutary for Europe, which I'll come back to. But I think one region that really could suffer from all of this will be Africa, because China and Russia arguably already have pretty exploitative policies going on in Africa. The US, which has been such a big contributor to aid for Africa, is withdrawing. And this is a continent I really feel could suffer, and that their civilians really could suffer, and that will drive migratory flows and cause a lot of problems, certainly for Europe. So some possible positives, it could get very messy and very painful in the short and even short and medium term, and at the moment it's hard to make that long-term forecast. But thinking about Europe and taking responsibility, I think for itself, I think there are potentially some very positive things about that. We've been outsourcing so much of our security to the US. This is a real wake-up call. Or if it isn't a wake-up call, we'll deserve what comes our way. But I think you could see Europe finally getting its house in order and dealing with kind of Trojan horses such as Hungary, which are really just undermining European order and put in place. Orban is essentially a put in place man. So there's the EU. I mean, I think the EU might develop new rules to deal with countries such as Hungary and Slovakia. It's going to have to look very seriously at what it does about that, because defending its liberal values is existential for Europe. Equally, defending Ukraine is existential, and that's going to require serious thinking about defence. I don't know whether NATO will continue. Or something will just continue in parallel form, but you could see a reformed NATO that might not necessarily include all of the countries that are currently in NATO. You might see a harder edge, and Britain will be critical to that.
Okay, I'm interrupting just because we're close to time. I'm going to just ask the other three speakers, not you, Rosemary, as you've just spoken, you're spared. I guess just to give a one sentence answer to a different question each. So, David, there was a question from the audience about the prospects for an impeachment of Donald Trump. So, is that likely? For Artyom, there's a question about fears that Belarus will be handed to Putin as a consolation prize. Should we be discussing that more? Again, it's a sort of yes/no question, really. And for Yuliya, Zelensky's recent comments that he was prepared to step down in return for, I think, either NATO membership or for some kind of security guarantees. Is there a risk that Zelensky stepping down will exacerbate any internal division or tensions within the Ukrainian political system? And again, I'm asking this just as a yes/no question because we need to finish. So I'm going to have to be brutal with time. David?
As long as the House is in Republican hands, there is zero chance Donald Trump will be impeached.
Okay, so we have to look towards the midterms in 2027 for the first possibility. Artyom? Okay, in that case, Yuliya?
Well, I think that was more of a figure of speech to signal that President Zelensky is not kind of holding on to his position, because at this point, I don't think it's practically possible for him to step down. And if he does, then there will be an election. And of course, election is a contentious time, but we will have an election at some point anyway. So.
Okay, and very last word, Artyom, one sentence.
Well, one sentence on Belarus. I think the most important thing is to not forget the biggest current humanitarian issue that Belarus has to be resolved in case of Belarus is over 1,200 political prisoners who are still in jail, and I think that it's vital to include this issue in any sort of discussion on the reset of any kind of diplomatic relationship in between West and Belarus, because it is an opportunity to get these people out, because Lukashenko is in a unique position of needing to insert himself into this regional processes.
Okay, that's a long sentence, but it was actually one sentence, I think. So thank you. Yeah, this has been, I mean, we've got lots of questions that we didn't get to from the audience. There are so many issues that were raised in the conversation that we didn't get to come back to, which I feel like this actually is something that we could hold a much larger event on. Let me just say there will be a short policy brief document that I will be writing based on this discussion. I will be trying to do it within the next couple of weeks. I expect it will probably take a little bit longer. Allow me to mention that previous policy briefs are on our website, warwick.uk/WABHub. Our next webinar will be on the 26th of March, when we will be talking about whether regime change in Belarus is possible without regime change in Russia. And then in the end of April, we will have a webinar where we talk about reconstruction in Ukraine on post-war reconstruction. So thank you enormously to our four speakers. It has been a really valuable and insightful discussion. Thank you as well to our two interpreters who have been working throughout the call. Thank you to our audience for your questions and for joining us. And thank you to our partners at Ukrainian Prism and Stockholm Centre for East European Studies. And I hope that we will see you all again very soon. So thank you.
And just one more thing.
Thanks.
We have a conference.
Oh.
Yeah. Slava Ukraini. Живе Belarus.
And for anyone still here, we have a conference in June when we will be discussing Ukraine, Belarus, and the complex geopolitics of Europe. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.